Hello, and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Bible Study, both Fellowship Sunday School class that meets in person on Sunday morning and those assessing virtually. Today is our final session of this year-long study of Paul's letters to the Corinthians. We will take a break until mid-January when we will begin a in-depth study of the epistle to the Hebrews. Today's lesson covers the final two chapters in 2 Corinthians, chapters 12 and 13. As I did last time, I will forego the reading for time's sake, but urge you to read that on your own. Recall the final four chapters in 2 Corinthians, scholars tell us, are from a different letter than that is used in the first 9 chapters of 2 Corinthians. Paul here is still mostly, recall, in the foolish boasting mode that he started back there in chapter 10, but as scholars tell us, he's less foolish but still boasting. He opens chapter 12 with a vision and revelation story. Dr. Carol Osick at Catholic Theological Seminary in Chicago teaches this is clearly a mystical experience of Paul's, even though he writes it in the third person. He remembers quite precisely when it happened, seeing the different levels of heaven, sensing being taken up to the level in heaven, and hearing secret revelations that he is forbidden to repeat. This is a good time for us to dig a little deeper into this area of the mystical side of things also, which Protestants tend to shun in some ways, if I can use that word, while Christianity in general, that is outside Protestantism, tends to accept very widely. These points Dr. Osick made here are characteristic of Jewish mysticism that was widely practiced by diaspora Jews before Paul's time. We saw it clearly in nearly all the books in the Apocrypha, and during Paul's time, both in the more Hellenistic areas, excuse me, and even in Palestine Judaism, teaches Dr. Timothy Johnson at Emory University. Mystical experiences were widely valued in the Hellenistic world and greatly influenced the early development of the Christian movement in both the eastern and western spheres of the religion, scholars tell us. So Paul here, by sharing this experience, has pulled out all stops, some scholars say, and achieved a one-upsmanship, if you will, on his competition. Some think that it's likely that the super apostles, that is his competition, have tried to do a similar thing, and that Paul has topped anything that they might do. Greek scholars teach this technique of telling a personal story in the third person was a very common form of hard rhetoric during Paul's time and before, and for quite some time afterwards, usually involving an event that was so grandiose that it wasn't going to be believed if it was told in the first person. But Paul here assures us it's something that did happen. He just doesn't describe it in the first person. Note that Paul's claims this happened 14 years ago, which means somewhere around 40 to 42 AD, according to most scholars that try to date it. So this is not the Damascus Road conversion story in Paul's life, because scholars date that to 35 to 36 AD based on what is said in Galatians and Revelation. in Acts. Scholars teach that these heavenly journeys or mystical episodes were often used in Judaism to confirm and authenticate divine approval of the messenger and the message. We see it throughout the Old Testament, says Dr. Johnson at Emory. He says, until the Enlightenment and the rise of historical criticism as a form of biblical study, biblical accounts were read and accepted as a faithful report concerning the teller. Study of Scripture was not an exercise of demystifying and verification as we use as our standards today, and as we attempt to do here by bringing in as much scholarship as we can. Dr. Paul Sampley at Boston University says Paul is here to be understood in his time, catch that point, in his time, as claiming both special status for himself against any competition that may appear, and that he has divine knowledge which he cannot repeat. This is most likely beyond anything that any of the competition could come up with in this war of words that's been going on here during these 4 chapters. Paul here and elsewhere has claimed credentials that include works of the Spirit, such as speaking in tongues, prophecy, and healing miracles. But he does not give specifics here in Corinthians. But note in your reading that he later renounces all this authority that might be there built on anything in this area of visions and revelations, but assures all that he is not lacking in this area. So he doesn't want them to judge him based on this, but he throws it out there probably because the competition has brought something up in this arena. Rather, Dr. Sampley says Paul has not relied on them in his ministry. In other words, he's not relied on any of these visions and revelations and so forth in his ministry to the Corinthians, but instead has done his work as a teaching preacher, as a missionary preacher and teacher, with them on a day-to-day basis for a long period of time. Remember, at the start, he was there at least 18 months. It is that experience he wants to be judged on. That is my real boast to you, he says, and he requests that they compare it, that is his personal activities with them, to others' work that might be claiming competition. As a challenge. He's essentially challenged. Put my works that have been done with you in direct comparison with whatever these other people are doing. The idea being, they will not match such in any way, shape, or form. In verse 7 through 10, Paul shifts to a different side of himself, the so-called thorn in the flesh. He refers to it in different ways, but that's generally the way it's often referred to. Variously interpreted by a range of scholars to be some kind of physical disability or illness. But Paul never describes it in specifics. Several suggest that that the reason he doesn't is most likely it's something that is so clearly noticeable and obvious to them, and that it impedes certain abilities that Paul might otherwise have, maybe even his effectiveness in some ways. He does not need to describe it. They know exactly what it is. They can see it. Just another reminder, Dr. Sampley says, that Paul is not writing to others. He's writing only to the Corinthians. And so as we use Paul's material, whether it's this letter or any other letter, always remember that. Because if Paul was writing to others, he would have had to have made some sort of specifics on some of these things so that you know what's going on. He claims he has asked God 3 times to remove whatever this obstacle is, which has not been granted him. So he knows God is aware of it, he says, and has chosen, that is, God has chosen, that Paul must work with it. Whatever it is, we don't know, but that's the position Paul is. Paul then switches things and says, this thorn is actually a type of miracle for me. It's been a miracle to him, he says, in that it has taught him to know that divine strength can be used in a weak man for the work of God. That human weakness does not stop whatever God's message needs to be. If, and he puts that if in there, if you surrender to God. Paul seems convinced that God's power, and when he uses that word power, he's essentially referring to what he usually calls grace, is brought in fullness in this weakness. In other words, by having the weakness and having to work through it, Paul is implying, I now more fully understand the grace. That's quite a important point several scholars point out, because Paul comes from a Jewish background where grace is not really taught. So he's made a major paradigm shift and now is claiming that I really understand it, I get it. In no way can he brag that he accomplished something on his own, that it was through my faith. This tested my faith. I had to trust in God, is the idea. And he proves that one cannot earn it or achieve it on his own strength. That is a major, major claim, theologically, for a person coming from a Jewish background, as Paul does. Many scholars add, it may well be this understanding that causes Paul to boast on his weakness, rather than for his strengths. A powerful message in its own right for all of us. And some scholars even add, may very well, this part here may very well be why this information in these 4 chapters actually got attached to 2 Corinthians. That this may very well be the more valuable theological message in all of those last 4 chapters. One teacher says, Paul, as a Jew, has taken the grace bait, hook, line, and sinker. I like that. In other words, this is Paul suddenly letting us know his eyes are open. He's made a change. Because there's very many aspects of Paul that would cause you to believe that Paul is very much still in the Jewish religion. And in many cases he is. But this aspect, theologically, places him over the line, so to speak. Paul also reminds them again that his refusal to accept personal financial support from them has in no way deprived them of anything. Clearly, scholars suggest that such a late reminder in this letter is a strong indication of how sensitive this issue of failure to accept funds from the Corinthians for Paul's personal support is a serious issue. His competition is likely bringing this up repeatedly, they say, and maybe even saying things like, well, if you just pay for your minister, you'd have a minister here with you all the time. That sort of concept. If you want a minister, pay for him yourself. You're depriving yourself of that by not doing that, allowing Paul to go wherever Paul wants to go. So Paul is again preparing for a 3rd visit with them, and reminds them he will again not burden them with his financial support. He's already taken care of that. The assumption is the Macedonians are taking care of it. He then gives them a list of many things not to do. He reminds them of his parental role to them. This issue that Paul sees himself as the parent and the Corinthian church as his children. And he uses it as an excuse not to accept children's support. And it's very possible, we can't quite confirm this, but it may very well be this is Paul's modus operandi throughout, that he always lines up support from a previous group before he goes somewhere else. We can see that in some of his letters, but you don't see it everywhere. But he quotes a cultural norm then in his defense. That is, rather the parent's responsibility to store up treasures for the children, not for the parents to be supported by the children. In late chapter 12, Paul seems baffled at times with the idea that the more he loves them, that the more he loves these Corinthians and expresses his love towards them, the less they love him. He seems especially concerned with how they are going to take this letter. Key point. All of a sudden, what is that? We know from the first 9 chapters in 2 Corinthians that Paul already knows how they took this letter. Just another reminder, very strong reminder, scholars point out, that this is written before the rest of 2 Corinthians. Because the first 9 chapters makes it very clear. He knows how they accepted it, and he was pleased with it, and therefore was in the mode of reconciliation with them in the first 9 chapters. In verse 19, he gives them his only specific or explicit, maybe is a better word, expression of love in these last 4 chapters, calling them beloved, a powerful word in his day and time. He reminds them his only purpose with this harsh letter is to edify them and not to destroy. But in chapter 13, he makes it clear in his closing that he will be harsh on any still disobedient when he comes. Quarreling, jealousy, and sexual sins are points that he makes that are aspects are totally intolerable. So he says, examine yourself before I get there as to whether you are living in the faith. You need to realize and practice in a manner that reflects Jesus Christ is living in you. That's his theology. I'll say that again. So he says, examine yourself before I get there as to whether you are living in the faith. You need to realize and practice in a manner that reflects Jesus Christ is living in you. I pray that you will become perfect, he says. Some scholars say that in this closing, Paul is making sure they no longer see him as a wimp. He is indicating that those who oppose Paul should no longer be members of the community of believers. It is thus to be understood, or implied understanding, if you will, that to reject Paul as God's agent and Christ's agent is tantamount to rejecting Christ. No ifs, ands, and buts are anywhere found in this. That's essentially where he's at. In Paul's closing of chapter 13, he uses the words found in the Trinity. But scholars are very quick to point out this is not the Trinity per se. The Trinity concept did not enter Christianity until a few hundred years after Paul. But as one scholar says, Paul sure helped that cause by the wording in his benediction here is the closing of chapter 13. The saying of the Trinity, as established by the early church, required Father to be said first, not Christ first, as Paul is using it. Taught the late Dr. William Baird of Bright Divinity in Texas Christian University. The late Dr. Fred Craddock at Emory University says, yes, Paul closes with a Trinitarian sounding text. but it is not the theological Trinity doctrinal statement in style or meaning as Paul has presented it here. Of course, those are both disciples, ministers and theologians there. You can very easily look at some other scholars and some other faiths, and you may get a different interpretation of that. In closing, I hope you have found the study of the Corinthian letters to be helpful to you. I clearly have learned much in preparing these lectures for you. As usually happens, the teacher's the one who learns the most. We now take a several-week break until the middle of January, when we will undertake a similar detailed study of the letter epistle to the Hebrews, which has been requested by a couple of members who are watching us virtually and on in the class. In the interim, on the virtual version, we probably will run some reruns of 2 Corinthians and 1 Corinthians, some letters that have some that appear to be stronger in theology and greater in interest, just to fill in that time space for you. I wish you well until we meet again. Have a good break.